AFC Supercoaches, welcome to the Teams Podcast, round 20. What a crazy day it's been. I'm only just getting my breath back. Brian Tuo, gone. Sean Johnson, gone. James Fisher-Harris, Cameron Murray, Adam Fanua-Blake, likely Luke Thompson as well. Pretty mental day. Wilson Smith, have you managed to avoid any of that carnage?
No, unfortunately. The Brian To'o injury is a massive hit for me. And the only reason I've avoided the Sean Johnson injury is because I never traded him in and I brought Cody Nikorima in instead, who is playing off the bench for the Warriors. So my Nikorima trade has completely backfired, but at least he's not injured.
Yeah, I've got Tuo and Sean Johnson. So 2 of those 6 I have. Thankfully, I've avoided JFH, AFB, Cam Murray, and Thompson. So I've only got 2 trades left. So I could trade both of those guys, but I can cover them. I can certainly cover Tuo because I've got David Nofaluma sitting there. So that's a decent replacement. I think I'll save a trade there. Then for Johnson, the guy I can bring in is Matt Burton, which is not ideal, but I might just cop it for 1 week and then see where we are next round and not waste a trade.
Yeah, so that's the thing. I think a lot of super coaches are actually in that same boat as you this week, in that they've only got 2 trades left, and they could make some trades, but they can cover it. So I think anyone who can save their trades and still field a team of 17 this week, I think it's probably the smart thing to just save your trades, because who knows, there could be more injuries next week, and then you've made trades and now you've got none left. So I've still got 5 trades left, and I'm tossing up. I also have Luke Thompson potentially suspended as well. Forgot to say that. But I'm sort of thinking I can still cover most of the injuries and field a full 17, assuming that Luke Thompson is cleared. If he doesn't, I have to make 1 trade. So I'm thinking I might trade out Adam Fanua-Blake this week, which is annoying because I feel like he's only going to miss 1 or 2 weeks, but I kind of have no choice. But yeah, like I was saying, if you can save your trades and still field a full team, I reckon that's the way to go this week.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Save those trades. There are many more injuries and many more suspensions to come this year. Plus, we haven't even got to the whole thing of resting yet, which will surely happen come rounds of 24, 25. So if you can save a trade, absolutely go for it. Let's run through the winners and the losers. First of all, on the winners list, Cody Walker picked up a knee injury on the weekend. There was some talk he was in a bit of doubt, but he has been named. Word is he will play. So good news on the guy who is currently topping the 5/8 position in Supercoach this year.
Yeah, and for anyone who had someone like Sean Johnson and didn't have Cody Walker, if you've got a bit of cash left over, I think, and you've got trades, of course, then SJ to Cody Walker is a no-brainer. I mean, he's been killing it. The South's amazing run of games is coming to an end soon. But like you said, he's been the best 5/8 all year. So absolute must-have.
Yeah, and he's the sort of guy who can fire up against good opposition as well, as he showed with the all-time record last year. What was the all-time record at the time against the Roosters? Nico Hines, good to see him, or as an owner, it's good to see him retain that fullback spot at the Storm. Ryan Pappenhausen is again on the bench. 60 points last week for Nico. He did look dangerous, but that is his worst score at fullback this year, which I think just goes to show how damn well he has been going since scoring that position.
Yeah, I was fully expecting Pappenhausen to have the fullback spot back this week and Nico Hines to potentially be benched. So really good to see him keep the starting spot. From what we saw last week, when Pappenhausen came on, it was actually more Nico Hines who sort of played in the middle and Pappy sort of went to the back, which I think we were sort of expecting the opposite to happen. But yeah, I mean, given all the injuries we've had, it's certainly nice to not have another forced trade with Nico Hines not benched this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Also at the Storm, Cameron Munster back after that little rest that he had last week. They split up their resting after Origin. So the likes of Munster, and I think it was Welsh and Kafusi got rested as well. For me, I think Munster's a pretty good purchase. He's in pod range for him at 17%. So if you are looking to sell Sean Johnson and you've got the right jewels, I don't mind Munster at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think for people who are in that boat of trying to replace Sean Johnson and they do need to make a trade, for me, Cody Walker and Cam Munster, obviously the best two. I also, as a bit of a pod, quite like Adam Dewey now that he's back in the 5'8" spot where he has been scoring a lot better this season. And the Tigers have a decent run, but obviously Dewey's a bit riskier. So Cam Munster and Cody Walker are probably the best two options.
Yeah, I like your call on Dewey. I think there are a couple of really good pods in Dewey and Daly Cherry Evans at only 7% ownership. We'll get to him later on, but he's got plenty going for him, including three big tons in the last 4 games. Next winner, Payne Haas. He's by far the most purchased player this week, attracting double the trades of the next guy in James Tedesco. So extremely popular. He's averaged 95 in the last 3 games. Of course, those 3 games have coincided with Matt Lodge and Tavita Pangai Jr. having left the club. So that means that he's really taken on this role of being the forward leader at the Broncos. Encouragingly, though, last week, he got no big attacking stats, but there were 14 tackle busts in there. I think it's a really good purchase for people who are looking to sell Fisher Harris. Tohu Harris is still a popular sell. Guys like that, Adam Fanua-Blake. Payne Haas is by far the best replacement for those guys.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, average front rower averaging 95 is in a 3-game average is incredible. So he terrorized the Panthers last week, and they've also got Tom Flegler suspended this week. So we know he's going to play big minutes again. And, like you said, he's not getting the massive attacking stats, but he's such a big guy and he's hard to tackle. So I think we can assume he's going to reliably get a lot of points and tackle busts. So there's no reason to conclude why he wouldn't be able to keep up his current form, which has been really good. So, yeah, with all the injuries, if people are scrambling and looking for a forward, he's by far the best option.
Moving on to the losers, and I'll warn you, there are plenty of them. First up is Brian To'o. As I mentioned, out for up to 6 weeks. He's getting exploratory surgery to see how bad the damage is. But it could be 6 weeks, in which case he's obviously a sell. Look, I don't have the trades. As I mentioned before, I can bring in David Nofaluma off my bench and cover him, which is a great replacement because I think Nofaluma is actually a decent purchase this week. A lot of people will be getting on, given that he's quite cheap and also has a really good run coming up, including 2 games against the Bulldogs. The other guys I think are good replacements like Ruben Garrick, who a lot of people own already. Dane Gagai, with the run that the Souths have, is pretty good. Daniel Tupu, and then the pod is Jordan Rapana, who was on fire at fullback last week. And his base stats have gone through the roof in the last few weeks. And when he's making 21 runs a game, he's busting tackles for fun as well.
Yeah, I quite like Rapana as a pod option there. He was probably one of the Raiders' best players last week, and it translated to Supercoach points as well because he fell just short of a ton. So, like him, I think with Toa, I mean, like we were saying before, it depends how many trades you've got, and if you can still field the team without trading him, I think you've got to keep him. But otherwise, there's some really good centre wing replacement options. For me, if money's not an issue, I would do him to Garrick straight away. I really like that. Dane Gagai a bit cheaper, but if money is tight, obviously I've been talking up Daniel Tupou for a number of weeks, and he hasn't had like a massive score yet, but he did crack 80 last week. And then I really like David Nofaluma as well as another cheap option. Yeah,
Nofa's definitely good value if you don't have too much cash. Daniel Tupou, just back to him. With Teddy back in the team, that's set to ignite him. They've moved Sam Wood over to the right, but Teddy, his favourite side is that left-hand side, and that That long cut-out pass from Tedesco to Tupu worked for them last weekend, and you'd think it'll happen for them pretty regularly going forward as well. Our next loser, Nathan Cleary, remains sidelined for the Panthers. So he has been training, but only doing running, no contact yet. And the fullback and captain this week, Dylan Edwards, said that Cleary is still a couple of weeks away, in inverted commas. So not good news for people who held on, but if you're a head-to-head player, he should be back right for the final series, or maybe even a week before the final series.
Yeah, I was especially devastated by this one because I was my initial plan was to, assuming he was back this week, was to sell Nikorima and Burton and upgrade to Cleary and get it enough. But obviously with other injuries and Cleary not back, I'm obviously not doing that. But that was my plan, which absolutely sucks. Again, I think if you've held this long and you've got other injuries elsewhere, you probably just have to keep holding Cleary, especially if you're in a head-to-head league. But it's not a good position to be in.
Next up, Sean Johnson. So the word on him is 4 to 8 weeks with a hamstring injury. He's got a long history of hamstring injuries. So you'd have to think that he's long odds to play for the Sharkies again. And whether he plays for them again probably hinges on whether they make the finals or not. So Sean Johnson is ideally a sell. Jerome Hughes is not by far the most popular replacement, but he is the most popular replacement. Granted, he is owned by almost 30% of Supercoaches already, so he is not a pod. If you're looking for the pods, DCE and Adam Dewey are the guys. And then you've got a lot of people going to the cheapie and Toby Sexton as well, who was really good on debut for the Titans over the weekend. Having said that, they do have Jamal Fogarty on an extended bench this week. So we'll wait and see what happens there.
Yeah, I'd definitely be avoiding Toby Sexton unless you were absolutely desperate and just needed to play for this week. But even then, he could be a late withdrawal. So I would be avoiding Toby Sexton. And we spoke about them before. Of those three names you mentioned, Hughes, DCE, and Dewey, obviously Hughes is the safest. But DCE has a lot of upside this year, scoring tries on the back of Tommy Turbo. So that's a nice pod play. And Adam Dewey I think he's been a massive surprise this year, actually, because even in games where the Tigers have lost sometimes, he's managed to crack a ton thanks to the goal kicking. So I think they're all good options. Hughes is the safest, but all three are good.
Yeah, I think one thing that sets it apart from me, DCE and Adam Dewey are essentially the same ownership at about 7%. So much bigger pods than Jerome Hughes at almost 30%. Moving on to the forwards, James Fisher-Harris, he's out for 3 weeks with the birth of his child. So again, ideally a sell. Cameron Murray only out for 1 week through suspension. So he is a hold. We talked him up as a pod last week. He went on to get 117 points. It's averaged 95 in the last 4 games. So he's looking really good in the run home at pod ownership under 10%.
Yeah, and the fact that he's suspended this week, and some people who manage to avoid other injuries may potentially sell, although I don't think it's many. I think he's going to stay a pod for the rest of the season. So obviously not one to look at this week, but if you've got trades left, one to look at in the coming weeks.
You mentioned Adam Fanua-Blake before. He's got a compound finger fracture. If you've got Twitter, I suggest you go and look at the NRL Physio's post of the post-surgery photo. It's quite gruesome, but it doesn't look like he'll be out for too long. So if you're really short on trades, Fanua-Blake is probably a hold. Ideally, he's a sell though.
Yeah, I watched the NRL Physio's video. It was pretty gnarly. And it more looked like it was a compound dislocation and not a fracture. So he didn't actually break the bone. The bone just pierced through the skin, which is good for him because it means he'll only be out for a couple of weeks as opposed to a bit longer if he fully fractured it. So, but I have Adam Fanua-Blake and I need a front rower if Luke Thompson is suspended this week, which it looks like he probably will be. So I might be forced to trade Adam for Noel Blake, even though I know he's probably only going to miss 1 or 2 weeks.
Tane Milne, it's time to cash him in. So he's not in the 17 this week. So you don't have to move. That is good news that he won't be an AE nightmare. But he's made 300K. So hopefully you've got some trades where you can cash him in down to enough. Or some people are going with Matt Fearnight from the Dragons as a cheapie. I don't agree with cheapies at this time of year, but if you're looking for a cheapie, he is the number one cheapie at the round.
Yeah, I'm the same. I had a few people asking me about him in the blog today, and I am also not a fan of cheapies at the moment, with the exception being if you're really short on cash and just need a centre wing to be able to field the full 17. And he has been scoring well the last couple of weeks, but the Dragons' run coming up is terrible. So for me, it's a massive avoid.
And the final loser is Tohu Harris. It's old news now, but a lot of people are just getting around to selling him. He's the third most sold player after that ACL injury that he picked up a couple of weeks ago. Let's run through each of the games. Roosters v the Eels is the first match in Mackay. It's good to take rugby league to some of the regions up there in Queensland, and a whole bunch of them are getting games this round. 2 big blows for the Roosters with no Billy Smith, foot injury, and Matty Cavallo with an ankle injury. That means Josh Morris comes in at centre after he was dropped last week, and Joey Manu shifts to the wing with Adam Kieran coming in at centre. So that's an interesting move for them. In terms of Supercoach, it is all about James Tedesco at the Roosters. He's the second most purchased player. He's only at 25% ownership, and let's face it, a lot of those are zombie players from the start of the year. So it's essentially in pod range. You can get him really cheap, essentially a 250K discount on his peak price. He was amazing last week. His schedule isn't fantastic, I will point out. Look, it's not for me. I don't have enough trades to do it, but a lot of people are getting off Clint Gutherson, who's got a horrible run coming up, and getting on James Tedesco.
Yeah, I mean, for me, especially with all the injuries we have, trading out Gutho for his bad schedule into Teddy, who also has a bad schedule, doesn't really make much sense.
Yeah,
it's a bit sideways and a massive luxury trade. But in saying that, I was actually, even though on paper this is a tough matchup, I was looking at his at Teddy's stats today, and he actually averages pretty well against the Roosters, so against the Eels rather. So it's not a terrible matchup. So I can understand why people are getting on, but for me, just a massive luxury trade, and you can only really consider it if you don't have Brian To'o in your team. You'd think.
Yeah, one factor to point out is that Victor Radley really has improved the Roosters' offense in the last couple of weeks, but they're still without Luke Keary, so they're not the attacking juggernaut they were in recent seasons. Another thing to point out as well is that this Gutho to Teddy trade is the 4th most popular trade this week as it stands, but all the ones before are injury affected. So, and these stats were taken before the Brian Tuo injury was announced. So with that Tuo injury there, I feel like this is a luxury trade and that people will be reversing Gutho to Teddy and fixing up other things in their team. Moving on to the Eels. Onto the Eels, Mitchell Moses, there's still no sign of him with that back fracture. Opicic is back in the centres, so Penasini drops out, and no Niokore due to a knee injury, with Bryce Cartwright coming onto the bench. Look, we've spoken a lot about Gutho. I don't necessarily agree with selling, but I'll throw some stats at you, Wilson. They've got the tough run coming up, essentially playing all top 6 sides in the last rounds. He's averaged 51 against top 6 teams this year compared to 97 against other sides. So you can see it's essentially half his output when he plays the top 6 sides. So you can see why people are looking at getting off.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he struggles a lot against the better teams, but I still think he has been extremely consistent this year, and he's one of the top point scorers on the season. So I can understand, given their tough run, why people would want to get off. But I mean, Teddy also has a tough run coming up. So, I mean, if you're selling Clint Gutherson because you're worried about his schedule, I think bringing in Teddy doesn't make a whole lot of sense, even though he probably will outscore Gutho in that period.
Speaking of that poor schedule at the Eels, we generally think that most people will get reduced scores against the sides that they're coming up against. However, I've dived into Isaiah Papali'i's stats. He's actually gone better against top six sides this year than he has against other teams, averaging 86.6 against top six teams. So hopefully we see a really good end to the season from Papali'i.
Yeah, I mean, the last couple of weeks with the return of Ryan Madison, Papali'i's minutes have actually gone down a bit, and he's been a little bit disappointing. But obviously, with all the injuries, you can't even afford to consider getting rid of him. So you've got to keep him. And hopefully these stats keep up and he can lift heading into the end of the season.
Next match is the Tigers v the Warriors. The Tigers have got some big changes with Luke Garner, Alex Seyfarth and Thomas McKaylee all injured. I won't run through all the changes there because really the only thing that matters Supercoach-wise at the Tigers is Adam Dewey. We've spoken about him a lot, but one stat that stands out for me is that he's averaged 84 at 5'8" this year, which is a fair way clear of the next best in the position in Cody Walker, who's averaged 6 points less. And Cody Walker's considered a grade of Supercoach. So Adam Dewey at 7% ownership, I think is a really good purchase.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we spoke about him before, and the fact that he's now moved back to 5'8" for the Tigers, where he started the season really scoring really well, is good. When he moved to centre, he had one good week and has been a bit inconsistent since then. But now that he's back at 5'8", he's definitely one to consider, especially if you are one of those players who needs to get rid of Sean Johnson. The fact that he's at really pod levels of ownership is really tempting.
Looking at their schedule here, the Warriors this week, and the Warriors are in absolute free fall and they've lost so many players. We'll get to them in a second, but they've got 11 of their top 30 unavailable. So that's an easy matchup. And they've got the Bulldogs twice. So it's an incredible run home, plus the Cowboys and the Sharks. Only one tough game against the Panthers. So I really do like Adam Dewey. And I like David Nofaluma as a value buy at centre wing if you're looking to make a bit of cash off Brian Tuol. Moving on to the Warriors, very depleted, as I mentioned. They've lost three props. Adam Fanua-Blake, Matt Lodge is out through suspension, and Leith Narmau is headed back to New Zealand. RTS is back in New Zealand as well. It's carnage at the Warriors. The wheels really are falling off. Supercoach-wise, though, there's not too much to talk about except that Adam Fanua-Blake is a sell if you have the trades. Moving on to the Broncos v the Cowboys. At the Bronx, still no Xavier Coates, so he's still in exile. They've lost Thomas Flagler due to suspension, so Keenan Palacia starts at prop and TC Rabadi comes onto the bench. Payne Haas is the flavour of the week at the Broncos, but we have spoken about him a fair bit. I do want to touch on Tessie New, though, who's been in pretty good form. He's averaged about 53 since returning to the top grade a few weeks ago. So his price rises have exceeded 200K, yet he's only owned by 8% of Supercoaches currently, even though he was one of the most popular players in the entire comp at the start of the year.
Yeah, an interesting one. I mean, he's looked solid since getting that fullback spot, and he could be a replacement option for Brian To'o. I still think there's better options, but Tessie has been pretty consistent the last couple of weeks and is a bit cheaper. So plus the pod ownership. So there's a couple of reasons to like him there, but for me, like you said, there's not much happening at the Broncos at the moment.
I'm not saying Tessie's buy. I'm just pointing out that he's the cheaper that got away really this year, going from somewhere near 50% ownership down to 8% ownership, and then just when everyone's sold, he's hit a bit of form. Moving on to the Cowboys, not much doing there. They've just got Ben Hampton returning from a pectoral injury on the bench with Dajeon Arce dropping out. The fullback extraordinaire, Jake Granville, continues the number one jersey. That was a bit of a shock, but he didn't look out of place in that position. In terms of Supercoach, the Jason Taumalolo bubble really burst last week. He'd been in some pretty good form, but only got 41 in 60 minutes last round.
Yeah, just when it looked like the Cowboys were finally figuring out how to utilize him again, his minutes were again all over the place and back to poor Supercoach scores like the start of the season. So the last couple of weeks looked pretty promising, and I'm sure a lot of people brought him in or were eyeing him off for the next couple of weeks, but now he's definitely one to avoid, I think.
Moving on to the Dragons v. the Rabbitohs. The Dragons have got so many changes, I won't bother going through them. But I'll mention that Jack Bird, Jack DeBellin and Josh Maguire are serving their bans this week. Matt Duffy's been dropped. There's no Cody Ramsey either. So it's a bit of an experimental squad with Corey Norman at centre as well. Supercoach-wise, you've got to be avoiding Dragons, really, but Ben Hunt is a guy I've got on my radar for in a couple of weeks' time. So he's been pretty gallant for the Dragons in the last couple of weeks, averaging 57 in that time, despite the fact they've been so depleted. But he's still going to lose a fair bit of cash. So he'll lose about 70K and be available in a few weeks for about $530,000, which is a pretty good purchase, particularly at hooker, which is a really tough position to cover.
Yeah, I'm still, for me, I would be avoiding all Dragons. Ben Hunt is probably the only one I might give a second look to. But I brought in Reid Marnie, so the fact that Ben Hunt covers hooker, I'd probably still be avoiding him. For me, the Dragons' upcoming schedule, they've got Souths this week, and then they've got the Raiders, Panthers, and Roosters. So for me, I think Ben Hunt would definitely be dropping a fair bit of cash. So, yeah, like a few other teams, I would just be avoiding the Dragons.
Matt Fairneye is the third most popular buy this week and by far the most popular cheapie. Under normal circumstances, this makes absolute sense because he's averaged 89 in 2 games. The BE is minus 112, and he's projected to rise by basically 150K. So all of that says that he's a great cheapie. But I think the time for cheapies is over. Having said that, if you've got enough trades to bring him in, make 150K this week, maybe even get it up over 200K next week, and then you have enough trades to trade him out, then he could be a really good little cash grab.
Yeah, definitely only one for if you've got plenty of trades left and need to make a bit of cash. But yeah, I agree that the time for cheapies is over. So, I mean, given all the injuries we have, it's not really a time to bring in nuffs either. So, for me, if you've got the cash, I would try and spend up on on a bit more expensive of a centre wing.
At the Bunnies, I mentioned Cody Walker and Adam Reynolds have been named and are set to play, despite being in a little bit of doubt earlier in the week. Cameron Murray's out through that suspension, so Jai Arrow starts and Liam Knight comes onto the bench. They've also got Campbell Graham back from a concussion, which means Supercoach cheapie extraordinaire Tane Milne drops out of the 17. Now at the Rabbitohs, it's all about Damien Cook, who went gangbusters last week with 148. I don't think it's any coincidence that this big game came in the week where he produced his most runs for the year, 8 runs, which is his best for the season. You can pick him up for 500K. It's a massive discount on his starting price. The value is there, but it's just been feast or famine for him this year. He's either got tons or scores under 50. He's got 9 scores of 50 or under this year. I just can't do it.
Yeah, Damien Cook, I started the year with him, and heading before Origin, I bit the bullet and just traded him out because I didn't think, like you said, it was feast or famine. He was either scoring really well or not well at all, and I found he was just he was getting poor scores more often than the big ones. So hooker has been a problematic position for us this year, and the Bunnies do have some good games left to come. So if you've got heaps of trades, I can understand bringing him in, but even then, he's not a locked-in starter every week, really, just because the runs haven't been there, and he's just been so inconsistent. So for me, it's definitely one to avoid. I would rather get someone like Reed Marnie.
Knights v the Raiders. The Knights have got Bradman Betts back from injury. David Clemmer's back from a concussion as well. Plus, they've got Mitchell Pearce looking to return from a hamstring injury. He's been named on the extended bench. So one guy who I've owned from the start of the year is Connor Watson. So the Knights have been absolute junk the last few weeks, but Connor Watson has averaged 76 in the last 3. So that's right up there in sort of keeper territory in that hooker position. Played 60 minutes as a middle forward last week and then switched to the halves for the last bit. So played the full 80 minutes. He's looking good. I've got him in my 17 this week, despite the fact the Knights are going so badly.
Yeah, I'm the same. I know lots of people have been selling him the last couple of weeks, but I stuck with him and I reserved him last week, and I'll definitely be reserving him again this week. Just now that he's back at lock and playing big minutes, making a bunch of tackles, and still having that attacking upside, he's a top 17 option for sure.
At the Raiders, they've got Jack Whiten back, so that's big news for them. They've also got Elliot Whitehead back as well, but they have lost Ryan Sutton with a sternum injury. Supercoach-wise, the guy to look at here is Jordan Rapana. I think he is the best pod replacement for Brian. We've spoken about him before, but the base is up for him. 21 runs in the last 3 weeks and averaging 10 tackle busts in that time. We'll move on to the Storm v the Panthers. At the Storm, they got Munster, Finucane and Kafusi all back after being rested. Harry Grant on the extended bench is interesting. So he could start cutting into someone like Brandon Smith.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for the Storm to have all their players back ahead of the grand final rematch here. But even with all the injuries at Panthers, I still think it's a tough matchup for the Storm. But in saying that, I really like Jerome Hughes as a top replacement for Sean Johnson this week. I mean, the Storm have just been their attack has been incredible this year, scoring points at will and scoring lots of points every game. So really like the Storm this week, even against the Panthers.
Speaking of the Panthers, they're really busted this week. I was really looking forward to this game, the grand final rematch, but unfortunately the Panthers are so depleted with no Cleary, Yo's out, Coruscant's out, James Fisher-Harris, Tyrone May, all on the sidelines. So they're cutting it pretty fine. They're pretty thin. I wouldn't be going near any player in this squad. Unfortunately, I have to hold Matt Burton. He is one of the more popular sells this week, but it's probably a luxury trade. I think that'll change once people realise that they've got to sell Brian too. So I'm expecting that to change. Bulldogs v the Titans, the Dogs. So the story on Luke Thompson is that he's facing a 3-week ban at the judiciary. He's pretty much up in front of the judiciary as we're recording right now. He was sensational last week. Best game I've seen him play in the NRL. Unfortunately, it looks like he could be out for the next 3.
Yeah, which is a massive blow for Supercoaches that stuck with him. He's had a bit of an up and down season. He obviously started the season suspended and then came in, was a bit up and down, then was really good for a long time. And then just as soon as I brought him in, he started dropping down again. Before picking up again, and now it looks like he might be suspended. So, on top of all the other injuries, this suspension could mean a lot of people have to sell him this week. I know if he is out, I need to sell either him or Adam Fanua-Blake, and I'm leaning more towards Fanua-Blake. But fingers crossed he is cleared at the judiciary.
Yeah, it's interesting that Thompson, one of the main reasons people bought him was for his safety. And now he's just gone up and down like a yo-yo in the last few weeks. Not a safe player at all and now facing suspension. At the Titans, David Fifita is the 3rd most purchased player. It's very simple with Fifita. Even with the reduced minutes over the last few weeks, his output Supercoach-wise has stayed basically the same. So he's dropped from being an 80-minute player to averaging 54 over the last 3 weeks. But his average has essentially stayed the same. He's so much better than anyone in that position when you consider Isaiah Papali'i as a front rower, which I think you should. You simply have to get him in.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously the reduced minutes is a bit concerning, but I'm not too worried about it. We saw what he can. We all know what he can do. He can come up with massive plays multiple times per game very easily. And the fact that he has the Bulldogs this week, all it takes is one big play, the Bulldogs make it pretty easy for you, unfortunately. So Fafita, definitely a risky captaincy option this week, potentially. But you've got to have him in your team.
Speaking of risks, Greg Marshew will be playing in a lot of 17s this week, I think. His game is perfectly suited to Supercoach, averaging 65.8. So that's pretty elite for a centre winger. And it could even be a sneaky money-making replacement for Brian Tuol. Let's move on to the Sharks v the Seagulls. Sharks, it's all about Sean Johnson. He's got to go, a definite sell. And then finally at the Seagulls, just 2 changes on the bench. They've lost Alawai to suspension and Kepi, who's headed back to Sydney for the birth of his child. Tommy Turbo as captain, lock it in. Daly Cherry Evans, we've spoken about a lot as a pod. I really like him. I think he's the best pod replacement for Johnson. And let's talk about Josh Schuster as well, finally. Averaged 80 since his return from that injury a couple of weeks ago. So if I owned him, I'd be playing him in my 17 every week.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people did stick with him even through all the uncertainty over his injury. But now he's back and slotted straight back into the team and has been looking really good. And we spoke a lot about Dewey and Daly Cherry Evans and Jerome Hughes and a few others as replacements for Sean Johnson. But Josh Schuster could be another sort of pod replacement option. And he's arguably a bit safer than some of those options, given that he's playing in the back row in the forward. So he's got a bit more base and still having that attacking upside. So, I think I'd still rather some of those other guys, but Josh Schuster's still one to consider.
Definitely, and certainly if you've owned him from the start, then you've done very well there. That's it for our team's podcast. Really crazy day. Thanks for coming on, Wilson. Thanks for coming on, Wilson. We'll catch you for the pre-lockout podcast tomorrow. See you then.